As a former creationist, and I was a Bible-believing, Genesis-believing creationist, and I was late to the evolution party. I got there, but I was late to the party, and realized I'm a higher primate related to all living things. But I get overwhelmed when I try to speak about this, verbally connect the dots from my ancestors to the modern primate, right? And, the names of the various dig sites and the fossils discovered and the versions of pre-humans and all that stuff. I'm like, probably you are. This is not my wheelhouse. I must lean on the shoulders of giants. Oh, look, I've got one on the line. Erika, who is host of the Gutsick Gibbon channel and a science educator. She was featured on a show I did a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Mel Gibson on Joe Rogan and, his invocation of the fake fossil and how this disproves all of paleontology, apparently. Anyway, Erika, you are not the hero we deserve today, but you are the hero we need. Thanks so much for coming. It's good to see you.
It's my pleasure to be here. It depends on who you are, but the hero, I might actually be a villain to some people out there. In fact, I know that I am a villain to some people out there. They don't love the topic that I'm going to be discussing today. People get really uncomfortable about this idea of being, a higher primate. And I put it in quotation marks because, as we'll maybe discuss a little bit, like what does being a higher primate actually mean, right? Or is there such thing as being more evolved than something else? The idea tends to make people uncomfortable, and it has for quite some time since the dawn of the discussions of this kind of thing back in the Enlightenment and even before. But that being said, there's a gaping hole in most people's, background and education when it comes to human evolution for the exact reason that I just mentioned, right? People get wigged out by this idea that we are these, clothed apes that are relatively hairless, and we walk around and we use these cool technologies and we talk to each other, and it makes us feel very divorced from the natural world. But this is all very recent, right? And I truly do mean recent in time, right? The past couple thousand years. If you go back just a little bit in time, the distinguishing factors between us and the other apes that are still alive today, and indeed, especially as we look back in time, become slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. Darwin famously said, "Man, although is well behaved, at best is but a monkey shaved." And the case that I'm going to make today, using the history of these discoveries and also a couple of, don't freak out, but anatomical characteristics, I think can make the case in a way that anybody can appreciate and sort of relay to the people in their lives that maybe find this idea kind of phenomenal, that we are these animals that have somehow managed to figure it out. And although I kind of these days especially am tentative in saying that we've got it figured out, clearly we're doing something right. So I'm excited to get into that.
Okay. Well, I know you've got sort of the story to tell, and I don't want to derail you, but I do want to set things up with a foundation. So can we start with some definitions? We talk about hominins and hominids. Can you define those for us?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you almost need to go back a little bit more, because everybody agrees, for example, that humans are mammals, right? We have hair on our bodies, and the females of our species produce milk. We have a special type of mandibular joint called the dentary squamosal joint. We have 3 inner ear bones that let us hear really well, better than most other critters. But we're also primates, right? That's a very specific type of mammal. That's our order. It's slightly more specific. And primates have a bunch of really cool characteristics that together you can't find in any other mammal, right? We have binocular vision. We see in high detail for our foraging and catching, prey like insects, especially for the small little guys. We have dexterous grasping hands that we can move around in the trees. We have very mobile bodies overall, again, related to that arboreality. And we've got big brains for our body size, even with the most primitive of primitive primates, like your lorises and your bush babies and your lemurs and things like that. But in addition to being primates, we're also a specific type of primate called a haplorhine primate, which is related specifically to a couple of features, craniodental features, so tooth and scully features that we don't have to get into. But we're also anthropoids, which is to say we're monkeys in general, right? Which is something that kind of freaks people out. Anthropoids too have a bunch of very specific characteristics that we could get into, but I'm trying to minimize the amount of morphology that we're discussing. We're catarrhines too, which means we're not just monkeys, we are old world monkeys. And finally, we are hominids. So hominid is the term that we use to describe the great apes. Now, the level above that is hominoid, which describes all apes. So it's the great apes and the gibbons. But when you get down to more specific with just hominids, that's only the great apes. So it includes humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos. And that's our little cadre of great apes. And great apes are defined by a couple of really interesting factors, right? Not only do we have big brains for our body size, but compared to all of their primates, our brains are enormous for our body size. We take a long time to grow up, right? We raise our kids slowly, and we have these long childhoods that take, a while to learn about the world around us. And this is a specific type of strategy that some animals take, grow up slow, have a few kids, but you've got a much higher likelihood of surviving to adulthood as compared to the other strategy animals use, which is have as many kids as possible with the knowledge that a ton of them are going to die. Like you think like frogs or fish or things of that nature. Great apes also have this particular pattern on our molars. If you open up your jaws and you look back at your molars, you'll see that they've got 5 cusps. That gives you a little Y5 pattern, which is, kind of cool. Apes have, obviously, no tails. That's one of the features that defines an ape, a great ape, is that we lack these tails. Of course, hominoids do too, but keeping in mind what defines a great ape as well. And we have these short, stiff lower backs that allow us to move around a little bit better with more stability up in the trees. These features define great apes to the exclusion of basically everybody else, like when they're found all together. Then we get to what a hominin is. A hominin is our specific lineage. So when we think about the split between humans and chimpanzees, and humans and chimps are one another's closest living relatives, and I should say humans and panins, so the chimps plus the bonobos, the 2 types of chimpanzee, they're really, really close together genetically and physically and geographically, etc. But we are ridiculously close to them genetically, 98.8% in our coding DNA, and about 96% when you look at the full genome. That is more similar than rats are to mice, which is absolutely mind-boggling. It's more similar than lions are to tigers, or African elephants are to Asian elephants, and it means that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related than any other species on the planet as far as humans go. Humans are more closely related to chimps than they are to anything else, but also chimps are more closely related to humans than they are to anything else too, them and bonobos, right? So that means that if you've got a chimpanzee and you want to find its closest living relative, it's not going to be a gorilla, which is something that people tend to think. Like it's like, oh, well, humans are close to chimps, but chimps are close to gorillas. Not so. Which is really interesting to think about, right? So what we can do is we can look at the genome of these 2 guys and look at the changes between 2 living members of each species and try to calculate when the last common ancestor between the 2 of us lived. So you can sort of make a comparison as if humans and chimps are sister species, then the common ancestor might be our parent, our mother. So that's the comparison that you can make between species level family trees and a human level family tree. So where is, this mother species in time? Approximately 7 million years in the past.
You can see why I asked Erika to join us. It's like a fire hose of information in the face. And I mean that as a compliment. By the way, I should have done this at the beginning, but I know people know you're a paleontologist, but can you do a quick bio intro, who you are and what you do, so before we continue our conversation? Because people are like, well, obviously that she's got some data, but what's her background?
Yeah, totally. And, I want to keep in mind, let everybody know out there that, I'm trying to teach this to, in a way that it's going to be comprehensible. So there's tons of little minutia that, you could list out as these characteristics that define little lumps on bones and things like that, anthropoids as compared to tertiary forms or whatever. But we're leaving those out for today. We're going to keep it as base level as we can with easy to see characteristics that everybody can recognize, right? So my background is I am a 4th year PhD candidate in biological anthropology. I'm hoping to get the doctorate here in the next year. But we'll see. I'm waiting on some grants to see if they give me money to go to Europe and collect some specimens, collect data on some specimens over there. I got my master's of research in primate behavior, biology and conservation from the University of Roehampton. And I got a BSA, so my bachelor's of science and arts in pre-professional animal science. So that was my bachelor's degree. And I was on the pre-vet track, but I ended up pivoting because I worked at a vet clinic and it really bummed me out. I say that every time, but I think it's worth mentioning. Thank the vets in your life. Their jobs are not easy. I picked up minors in biology and in anthropology when I was an undergraduate. And I basically go yearly to Kenya to collect data at the museum there. And on years, for the past several years, I've been going out and doing field work in West Kenya at a site called Koru. So I look for Miocene ape fossils, which incidentally are the guys that lived right before that split between humans and chimpanzees.
Two more definitions, if you'll indulge me. I'm a Homo sapien. Flesh that out for me. Homo sapien. What are we talking about?
Yeah, so Homo sapiens means, wise man. Of course it does, right? Like we give ourselves the name and we're like, well, we're the wisest of all the animals. And this was done by Linnaeus back in the 1700s, the father of taxonomy and a creationist himself. And I bring this up specifically because basically everybody was a creationist at the time of Linnaeus when, naturalism and this sort of burgeoning field of being a gentleman naturalist was coming to light. And Linnaeus, for all his wisdom, recognized that humans were in fact most closely allied with other apes. And so what he did when he was classifying humans into our species, Homo sapiens, is he created a higher level category called anthropomorpha, the man-like animals. And he pulled all of the other apes up into anthropomorpha, basically saying that, we're humans, we're the wise men, and these guys are like us. They're close, but they're not quite there yet. And this actually made a lot of people kind of mad because they were like, well, humans are made in the image of God. Like, you can't say that they're man-like. That's like saying like they're God-like. And Linnaeus was like, well, I don't know what to tell you because I've dissected 1 billion of these things and they have all of the characteristics that we have. And what I mean when I say that is that Linnaeus, being the father of taxonomy, invented that classification scheme that you see. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It's basically a way by which we organize life on Earth so that we can discuss it. And it's in a nested system. So species is more specific than genus is more specific than family, and so on and so forth. And there are a lot of little mini categories that can fit in between there. But species is your most specific categorization. And for us, that's Homo sapiens. Our genus is Homo. Our family is Hominidae, the hominids, as we discussed earlier. And so when we're communicating what a species is, or a group of animals that belong to a specific species, it usually has a set of characteristics that defines it, to the exclusion, when they're found all together, of absolutely everything else. So humans as a species today have a ton of characteristics that only humans have today. We have huge brains, we walk bipedally, we have little teeth and little jaws, things of that nature.
One more, and then I'm going to let you do your thing. I don't mean to, I don't want to put the cart before the horse.
I want this to be more of a back and forth.
Okay, good. Well, I've heard the word species many times from you, but if we get into the creationist, especially the young Earth creationist, Canham at Answers in Genesis talks about species versus kinds, which is supposed to help to explain how all of the Earth's animals were represented on Noah's Ark. Is kinds a thing in science, Erika?
No, kind is not a thing in science. And all you need to do to see this is to look at their literature. You don't even need to look at what actual science says. And mostly this is because actual science is not talking about kinds. We left creationism in the dust in the Enlightenment, truly. And a lot of people don't talk about this, but a lot of this is because of the work of Christian scientists from the day who were like, yeah, this isn't going to work. Creationists don't know their history, but they don't know a lot of things. So kind is generally a very vague higher order classification that includes a bunch of different animals that are related to one another. They are okay with those guys being related through common descent. Because, Seth, as you probably know, creationists don't have a problem with evolution by natural selection. They have a problem with taking that back in time to its inevitable conclusion, which is common descent from a single common ancestor. That's where they have their little bugaboo. So they're cool with saying that species can change over time. And, in that way, they say that Noah, God creates all these kinds in the beginning. And then, of course, the global flood happens. And during this global flood, God tells Noah to take 2 of every kind of animal onto the ark. And the ark can only be so big. And we know how big it was, according to the Bible, because they give us the dimensions, a very inconvenient fact to creationists in general. But because we have those dimensions, we know how many critters can actually fit on that ark. And because we have the fossil record, we know that there are like billions of species that have existed over time. So they can't have 2 of every kind of species come on that ark, which is why they broadened up what kind can be. And so, for instance, today, Answers in Genesis will say that all the cats share a kind. and all of the cats are related to each other, but none of them are related to, say, dogs. Or all the dogs are related to one another, but none of the dogs are related to, say, bears, and so on and so forth. And the problem with this is that we have animals that bridge those kinds in the fossil record and also living today. And their answer to that is, of course, to just say, well, that's its own kind too. But the biggest inconvenience comes when they look to the apes, right? Because humans, again, as I said earlier, are most closely related to chimps and vice versa. So they can't say that humans and chimps are the same kind. That ruins their entire narrative that humans are these specially created, unique animals. And for the record, Ken Ham thinks humans should belong to a separate kingdom. He doesn't even think we're animals, which is farther than any naturalist, no matter how creationist they are, has ever gone in the history of biology, right? Linnaeus didn't do this. Richard Owen didn't even do this. He accepted that people were mammals, at least. Ken Ham's crazy. We know that to be the case, though. Anyway, so they needed this category to be broad enough to include the fewest amount of animals to fit onto that boat, and then also diversify and explain modern biodiversity today. And humans and chimps present this massive roadblock to that, because genetically we are so similar to one another that if you separate humans and chimps into separate kinds, then you have to separate lions and tigers into separate kinds, and African and Asian elephants into separate kinds, and rats and mice into separate kinds. And that is too many animals to fit on that little boat.
I was in a conversation, I'll never forget this, a few years ago, and I was talking about the human animal, right? We're primates. We are animals. And the Christian said, well, we're not animals, we're mammals, but we're not animals. You want to speak to that for me, Erika? You want to go there?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, people don't understand, and this is where our education system, at least here in the States, has failed them, because they don't understand that these categories that we assign, as I alluded to earlier, are nested within one another. So all chimpanzees, or Pan troglodytes, are members of the genus Pan. All members of the genus Pan are members of the family Hominidae, or the great apes. All great apes are primates. All primates are mammals. All mammals are chordates. All chordates are animals, and all animals are eukaryotes, right? It's like a little Russian nesting doll. If you occupy a smaller Russian nesting doll that is within a bigger one, everything that's within that smaller Matryoshka doll is also in that bigger one by its very definition. So you can't say something is a mammal without it being an animal. Every mammal, because it is nested within Animalia, is an animal. Every primate is a mammal. Every ape is a primate. Every great ape is an ape, right? Like it doesn't matter how you do it. You're routed by the very system that a creationist developed to organize God's creation. That was his specific goal in the 1700s.
Okay, so I'm a non-scientist, and I try to look back through time, and I keep thinking when, and this is my desire for a simplistic answer, which I know doesn't exist, but when did it happen? When did this split happen? When did we come to a fork in the road when I was something else? Some kind of a quadruped thing, or I had fans or gills. I mean, I don't know. And then there's like, was there a fork? And all of a sudden I began the road toward being the evolved primate that I am?
Seth, this speaks to a really important concept in evolution that a lot of people don't get, which is that evolution doesn't have a goal. It's easy in retrospect to see where these forks happened, but in real time, evolution isn't trying to create anything. It's a filtration process. And I think we have to define what evolution is. It's change over time. That's it. And, intrinsically linked to this is that if species can diverge, if new species can form from a parent species now, if you take that back in time, mathematically, everything will converge on a single common ancestor, just like a family tree, right? It's a very simple concept. And that change over time can be morphologically or physically, the physical characteristics that we have. And I'm going to be using the word morphology probably a little bit in this conversation. It's just your physical characteristics. And also genetically or across your genome. That change over time is happening, obviously in both, because when it happens in your genome, it happens physically as well. So, you ask when this happens, and you could pick a time period, any of them, and look at where our ancestors were at that time, because by necessity, we have an ancestor at any point in time going back to the first life on Earth, the last common ancestor of everything living today. But I think for our purposes today, we'll start with when we split from chimps, because that's when things really start to get interesting from a perspective of what makes us human and what makes us a human animal, right? What makes us an ape. And when we look at the molecular clock, that tells us that happened about 7 million years ago, 7 million years in the past. And the molecular clock, as I said earlier, is just looking at the differences between humans and chimps and sort of taking that back in time. So evolution then, if it applies to humans, and Darwin addressed this exact same flippin' question back in the 1800s, first when he published Origin in 1859, and then again when he published Descent of Man in 1871. And when he published Origin, he didn't mention humans but one time. And all he said in the entire book, and it's a very dense book, is that light will be thrown on the origin of man. And so when people read Origin, of course, what they took away was, oh my gosh, this is a phenomenally elegant means by which to explain how organisms survive and change over time. And then the other immediately after thought was, wait, does this apply to humans? Because unbeknownst to a lot of creationists, right, is that at that time, people accepted that humans were animals, but we believed ourselves sort of specially endowed animals, and animals only in a physical sense, right? And so Darwin, makes this prediction. He effectively says, well, if humans evolved from more basal apes, we should see that morphologic or physical change over geologic time. So if we expect this morphologic change over geologic time from this generic ape, right, that comes before, we're becoming more specific. Humans are still apes, but we're getting more specific to hominids and then Homo sapiens. What does that morphologic change look like? Well, we could look at chimpanzees, which is what people did in the first place, like what Darwin and Huxley and Linnaeus before they did in the first place. And they look at humans and chimps. What makes us different? There's two main things that separate humans from all other living apes, and in fact, from the apes that lived prior to 7 million years ago. And that's big brains and bipedalism. Bipedalism means walking on two legs. We're the only ape, we're the only primate that has these huge, gigantic brains for our body size, even for an ape and even for a primate. And we also walk weird, right? And all these other guys, they hang out in the trees, they walk on their fists when they come to the ground, or they walk on their palms, or they walk on their knuckles. We walk on 2 feet, and we do it all the time, which is very weird. It's an odd way to move. Really, the only other animals that do this obligately or because they have to is like birds. Other than that, it's mostly just us. It's a weird way of walking. And so I'm going to boil it down to these two characteristics. We should see if human evolution is legitimate, morphologic change over geologic time, in that brains should get bigger, and we should start to see apes stand up and walk around on 2 feet. Fortunately, both of those things are recorded in your bones, right? A chimpanzee can't walk bipedally for its entire life. It gets pathologies. And humans can't walk quadrupedally for our whole lives, or else we get pathologies. And we know this because there have been humans who have done that, and there have been circus chimpanzees who have been trained to walk upright, and they do it for their whole lives, and then they die young. Which is to say, we know when the morphologic characters demand a certain type of movement. So what do we see? Right? We've set the stage. We know what needs to change over time. We know when it needs to change over time, and we know when it starts. So when we go back to 7 million years ago, what do we find? Well, in the year 2000, we discovered a hominin that's been named Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Now, Sahelanthropus tchadensis, for all intents and purposes, looks apish, right? It's this little pinhead. It's got a teeny tiny little brain, really no bigger than a chimpanzee's, and it's got that chimpanzee face with that big snout and this huge brow ridge. Overall, it's nothing to write home about. In fact, when they first pulled it up, some people were like, "Oh, it's like a chimp ancestor. That's kind of cool." But then you flip it over. And when you look at the underside of this thing, you can see that the foramen magnum, this is the hole at the base of the skull where your spinal cord comes out, is pushed forward compared to that of a chimpanzee. And it looks more like that of a human. And that's really important because where your spinal cord comes out at the base of your skull determines how you hold your head. If it's pushed forward, that means that your head sits upright on your spinal column like that. And if it comes out at the back, it's more to sort of like a slant like that, and that implies that you're walking on all fours at some points. You're knuckle walking around, and it demands that position and that corresponding locomotion, right? You think about your dog. Your dog's foramen magnum is in the very back of its skull, right? Approximately like right here. If your dog tried to stand up and walk on 2 feet like that, its head is cranked upward all the time. It's not sustainable. It literally could not move in that way. Without, again, developing pathologies. So that forwardly placed foramen magnum suggests to us that Sahelanthropus tchadensis was holding its head upright, more like a human than like pretty much any other Miocene ape that came before it. And in addition to that, it also has little canine teeth in both males and females, which is pretty unusual for other apes, with the exception of gibbons, because the males compete for access to females. They tend to have bigger canine teeth, not by much in chimps and bonobos, but by a lot in like gorillas and chimps. So they look at this thing and they're like, okay, theoretically, as you move back to that common ancestor between humans and chimps, the difference between the first on the human line and the first on the chimp line, those things should be almost identical, really. The characters that define them as on the chimp line or the human line should be so scant. And when we look at Sahelanthropus tchadensis, we find like the scantest of the scant. Foramen magnum's a little bit forward, canine tooth is a little bit small. And then they decided to get some dates on this thing. And the date that came back for Sahelanthropus tchadensis, found in Chad in the year 2000, is 7 million years ago. Like dead on with that molecular clock.
Well, let me jump in. Hang on. Let me jump in real fast. And I'm going to play a little Mel Gibson riff here. How do you know that? And this is usually when they say carbon dating, which just like, well, that's the wrong measuring tool, right? But how do you know 7 million years? How do you get there?
Yeah, I mean, that is a phenomenal question. So radiometric dating is the means by which we typically glean ages for fossils. And we combine radiometric dating with the law of superposition, which was developed by geologists during the Enlightenment, Hutton and Lyell and folks like that. So basically, if I may pull out my whiteboard, Seth.
Yeah. Visual aids. I'm all about that. Yeah.
I think it should help. We'll use pink. I like that color. So let's say let me make sure we're doing all the glare there. Let's say this is our geologic column, right? The geologic column deposits in layers. Everybody can agree on that. And at various levels in the geologic column, you find fossils and rocks and things of that nature all throughout it, right? The law of superposition tells us that the lower layers were deposited first and are thus older than the upper layers. Now, all you have to do to see this is get one of those sand toys and shake it up and let the sand deposit, and you'll see that this is true every single time. What that means, too, is that the fossils that you find down here are older than the fossils that you find up here. Now, what's really cool about this is the law of superposition can give you the relative age of fossils, but to find the absolute age of fossils and of layers themselves, you need to use radiometric dating. So radiometric dating, it relies on one thing. That the laws of physics are constant as we move backwards through time. It relies on the fact that amongst the isotopes within rocks, like rocks contain elements come in various isotopes. When we look at these isotopes, some isotopes are stable and some are unstable. Unstable isotopes will spontaneously decay into a more stable version of themselves. This is what we see in everything. We see this phenomenon in chemistry as well, right? Things want to be stable. So they, I say want, like they desire it.
Sure, I got you. I'm tracking.
Yeah, they want to be stable. They want to move to a more stable state. So they spontaneously decay into a more stable version of themselves. What that means is that if you can tell the rate at which unstable isotopes become stable isotopes, if you know the rate at which that happens, which we do because we've tested it a zillion times in the lab, you can take any given rock, you can look at the ratio of stable to unstable isotopes, and you can take that back in time to when it was all unstable, right? The amount of time that it would have taken for all of those now stable versions of that isotope to be their unstable counterpart. And that will tell you the age at which that rock formed. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. My next question is, are there different types of radiometric dating? I know carbon dating is good to a certain pretty shallow depth of time. And then there are others that you use for dinosaurs, et cetera. So, are there different types of tests?
Yeah, there are tons, dozens, right? And you can corroborate them with non-radiometric means. So carbon dating is great for recent stuff. It's pretty good up until about 50 or 60,000 years into the past. But if you want to go really deep in time for things like fossils, you need like uranium lead or argon. And the reason they all have two elements is because you're talking about the relationship between the unstable and the stable, right? The rate at which uranium decays into lead, the rate at which, I forget which isotope of argon it is, but the unstable isotope of argon decays into the stable version of argon, right? And so there are a bunch of different methods of radiometric dating that you can use to look at these ratios within these rock layers, and you can test them against other types of radiometric dating, or you can test them against things like ice cores, right? The rate at which ice deposits in the Arctic and the Antarctic. You can look at the relationship between, or the dates between, radiometric dating and how fast tree rings form. Or you could compare it to thermoluminescent dating. You could compare it to the rate at which the continents move apart from one another, because the clock starts ticking for this decay of unstable into stable. They start doing that decay once the rock is formed, meaning you can go to these places in the earth where new rock is forming and being pushed out because of the movement of the continents, and you can compare the age that you get along that movement to the origin point of those rocks and the rate at which those rocks are moving outwards using satellite data, right? They match. They shouldn't match. The rate at which the continents move apart and the rate at which unstable isotopes decay into stable isotopes, those should not match one another if the Earth isn't very ancient. It's really, truly phenomenal support for the notion that the Earth is super duper old. And people appreciated this without even the advent of radiometric dating. Again, in the Enlightenment, Charles Lyell and James Hutton before him and all of their geology friends, they knew the Earth was old because they looked at the world around them, like the White Cliffs of Dover, right? Or the formation of the Red Sea. And they said, this kind of stuff happens slowly today. So in order to explain the formation that we have today, you have to go really far in the past if it's working the same way today as it did in the past. So with that understanding of radiometric dating, right, a fossil isn't made up of the right type of rock to radiometrically date. You can only radiometrically date igneous rocks because igneous rocks are the type of rocks that form in volcanoes, meaning the composition of that rock with relative certainty. Whereas with metamorphic rock or sedimentary rock, you can't be sure, or it's usually composed of several different types of rocks, meaning when you radiometrically date it, you're not sure which part of the rock you're dating. That's why you need igneous rock to date. So what that means is that you can't typically date the fossil themselves, right? I can't take a sample off of Sahelanthropus tchadensis and run it, through a mass spectrometer and try to radiometrically date it, try to get an age for that thing. So what you need to do is you need to date the layers that the fossil is found in. So let's say Sahelanthropus tchadensis is right here in this little layer that I'm marking with my expo marker here. What we can do is we can date either this layer itself, right? If there's ash in that layer, or if there isn't, we can date the closest ash layer above and below it. So let's say this ash layer is 6.99 million years old, and this ash layer here is 7.01 million years old. When we know that Sahelanthropus tchadensis is found in the layer in between these two that we could radiometrically date. So we know that it's in between 6.99 and 7.01 million years old, 7 million years old.
Was it you who said, ironically, that many of the creationists who say that radiometric dating is false rely on the oil and gas industry, which uses types of dating to do what it does? Like our scientists use this all the time, and they accept it over here, but not when it comes to primates and the age of the Earth. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, 100%, right? Like we require radiometric dating to base and model, right? So when we drill for oil, you don't just want to drill in a random spot. If you drill in a random spot, you're wasting money because incidentally, it costs a lot of money to operate a drill that is capable of breaking into, an oil deposit. So you want to be really careful about where you set that drill down. And we know, based off of looking at all of the rocks in the world, that some formations from some time periods are more oil or natural gas rich than others. So for instance, the Permian is great for natural gas. You can go to the Carboniferous for coal. These time periods need to be, isolated in formations. Like if you come across a formation, you want to model that basin to find out if it's the right type of rock, the right time to drill there and see what you can find. So what they do is they send geologists out to areas that might be rich in these natural resources to basin model. They model the basin. And the way that they do that is they radiometrically date the rocks. So if you've got this idea of, there might be oil over here. Let's say I'm a geologist. You send me out there. I'm going to radiometrically date it. I'm going to characterize the basin with index fossils, et cetera. And then if I come back and I say it's got all the little tiny microfossils of the Carboniferous and it's dated to, hundreds of millions of years ago during the time period that the Carboniferous took place, you can drill here. You're probably going to find, coal. You're probably going to find a coal seam here. And this is a multi-trillion-dollar industry that, ironically, is these oil and gas companies are often helmed by people who are Bible-believing Christians, right? But of course, they rely on radiometric dating and the implicit ideas that go along with that, namely being the ancient age of the earth, to actually carry out their jobs. There was a young earth creationist oil industry, Seth. It's called Zion Oil and Gas. Guess how wealthy they are.
Okay, I'm going to come back to, when I say the dawn of man, I always think about the first 15 minutes of Stanley Kubrick's 2001, you know.
Course, yeah.
But I always think about that Victorian era illustration, the March of Progress. It shows the ape, and then you see more upright, and then there's a biped, and then you see a man in a business suit, and this is supposed to be the progression of human beings. That's total bullshit. Is that right?
Yeah, completely. Evolution isn't linear. Right? A family tree isn't linear. It's not, your grandma becoming your mom, becoming you, right? You have these descendants that split off in their own directions and are subject to the forces of evolution, to the mechanisms of evolution, natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, their own mutations. And so they become their own species. And what this means is that you don't have a line that represents evolution. You have a branching pattern. You have a tree, which means that at various points in time, there weren't just the human ancestor, the human hominin, the one that was on the trajectory to us. There were dozens of other hominins that lived and eked out their own living and lived for, in some cases, millions of years successfully as an animal goes. And we just happen to be the only ones left, which is why it feels linear and why it was depicted as linear.
So 7 million years, and then is there what's the next, I don't know how to say it, Erika, the next step or the next evolution toward us today?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll tell you too, Sahelanthropus tchadensis is controversial among some, namely because it's a crushed skull. So it's difficult to know for sure whether or not, I tend to buy the location of the foramen magnum. I think it's a hominin. I think that the reduction, the canine teeth, and the location of that hole at the base of the skull can tell us that it's at least something that's relatively close to a hominin, right? Insofar as we have characteristics that define a hominin. And there are people who have issues with the dates as well, namely because it was a surface find. So let's say that you don't buy it, right? Like, let's say you're like, no, Sahelanthropus tchadensis, I don't think that that's the first hominin, right? And remember that the human characteristics that we're looking for are steps towards bipedalism and big brains. Just for today. Again, there's a ton of little mini ones. Let's just say we're looking at those two. And we're going to skip over Auroran because I don't have a skull for it. So we're going to go to the next one that I have a cranium for, which is Ardipithecus ramidus at 4.4 million years old. And both of these guys, for the record, they're found in Africa. So Ardipithecus ramidus is super interesting for a couple of reasons. It's my favorite hominin, actually. So you look at it, and first of all, it's a wonderful fossil, right? You look at this cranium here, this skull, and you notice that we've got a lot of material here on the right side and less material on the left. But the nice thing about hominins, and the nice thing about virtually all mammals, if I'm, unless I'm missing like a weirdo somewhere, is that we're bilaterally symmetric. And a lot of creationists don't understand this, but what this means is that if you have the right side of the fossil, you know what the left side looks like too, right? I don't need to have this part of the brow ridge to know that it looks like this, right? You could just take the right side and reflect it over onto the left. And this means that when you find a fossil, you've actually usually got a lot more of it complete than you might think, because you reflect it over, and then you can connect the gaps in between. There's only so many ways that a zygomatic arch here can complete itself, right? I have this part sticking out here anteriorly or towards the front, and then I have this part sticking out here posteriorly or towards the back. It's not going to come out and do a loop-de-loop. It's going to connect in the middle. So in this way, we tend to have a lot more of fossils than we appreciate at face value. So Ardipithecus ramidus was discovered in the 1990s, but it wasn't published on until 2009. Tim White and colleagues sat on it for a really long time, and it's this wonderful skeleton. So in the case of a lot of fossils in general, you'll have partial remains, teeth, bits and pieces of skulls, bits and pieces of long bones. But it's really, really rare and wonderful to find partial skeletons. And that means, when you've got the skeleton more than just the skull, that can tell you a lot more about how it moved. So the first thing you want to do when you look at Ardipithecus ramidus is assess it for our two traits. Does it have a big brain? Nope, it's a total pinhead. A little teeny tiny brain, just like we would expect for something very early on in human evolution, something very, chimpy looking kind of. But when you flip it over, that foramen magnum is forward again. And it is unambiguously forward, right? Because you've got the connection of these bones all up the side. It can't be anywhere else other than right here. What that means is Ardi sat with its head directly on top of that vertebral column, standing at least upright with a posture more similar to humans, than any great ape, any other great ape. But in addition, Ardipithecus ramidus has part of the pelvis preserved. Human pelvises are really weird. They're really unique. And they're directly related to how we move. An animal that walks on all fours has a really different pelvis than an animal that walks on two legs like us. And the pelvis in general can be broken up into 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. In humans, that top part of the pelvis, the ilium, is really short, and the bottom part, the ischium, is also really short. And the reason that both of them are short is because we pack gluteal muscles on the side, and that's what helps us stay upright, right? Stand upright and get on one leg, if you're watching this video, or just anywhere where you are, as long as you're not like driving or something, and you'll immediately feel your glutes activate to make sure that you can balance and stay upright. We use our glutes to run. We use our glutes to walk for long distances. Chimps have really weak glutes, but ours are powerful. We need that short, outwardly flaring ilium to pack those muscles on. So when you compare a human and a chimp, they're both really short, so you can pack them outwards, where in chimpanzees, they're really long because they're more like these thin slabs. In Ardipithecus ramidus, the top part of the pelvis, the ilium, is short like a human's, but the ischium is still kind of long. It's literally transitional in a part of a collection of bones. You couldn't ask for a cooler transitional fossil. Part of the bone, or the collection of bones, looks like a human, looks more like a human, and part of it looks like a chimp. So it's got that anterior foramen magnum, and it's starting to get that pelvis that looks more like a human as compared to previous hominins. At 4.4 million years ago, if you see this hominin, right, that has some characteristics that are more modern and some characteristics that are more primitive, and the ones that are more modern are related to walking upright, you can naturally ask the question, well, why would it change to move upright? And I think that the answer that is intuitive to a lot of people is, well, it probably came out of the trees. It probably had to be on the ground more. So what do we see when we look at the environment in which this hominin, in which Ardipithecus ramidus lived? Paleoanthropologists argue that when you run a paleoenvironmental analysis on its habitat, it was a mixed woodland, which means that it was clusters of trees separated by wide open spaces. Ardipithecus ramidus would have needed to be at least capable walking upright, which is actually a more efficient way of walking than walking on all fours as far as metabolic expenditure goes. It would have needed to be more efficient, moving from tree cluster to collect fruits.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you, Erika, then the primates that were on the plains, and they were, better at surviving on the plains, adapting, procuring resources, reproducing on the plains, they would have been the ones then more to reproduce, which created more bipeds. Am I tracking?
Yeah, imagine a rainforest, right, where Sahelanthropus tchadensis, this guy, and the likes of it are living. And they're upright in the trees, like some apes are even today. Gibbons are upright when they're in the trees. And when they come down to the ground, they run bipedally, although they're really, really bad at it. And the rest of their anatomy corresponds with something that it's very, apish. They don't have the pelvis that looks like ours. They don't have an S-shaped spine. They don't have a toe that's in line with the rest of their toes. They don't have a valgus knee. All these little characteristics that make a biped. Gibbons have one of them, and it's a slightly more anterior foramen magnum because they're upright in those trees. But what happens when you have an ape that's upright in the trees, and then the trees go away? You get an ape that's upright on the ground. Remember what I said about those forward foramen magnums. If that foramen magnum is forward, you can't be a quadruped, right? You're going to be looking down at the ground all the time. So if it's upright in the trees, so it can hold its arms directly above its head and move around, when those trees go away, it is necessarily going to be walking upright on the ground, which means that there is immediately, as these trees start to disappear, a massive selection for apes that are capable of moving efficiently and quickly upright when they're on the ground. The ones that can't are getting killed off. They're not capable of getting food. They're dying of starvation and dehydration and things like that. But the ones that are slightly more advantaged towards efficient bipedalism when they do come down to the ground are going to experience that selection pressure to move even more in that direction. And the more important bone between the ilium and the ischium for maintaining that bipedality, especially early on, is the ilium. It's the one that we would expect to change first, and it's the one that does.
So we're at 4 million years. What happens next, Erika?
Yeah, we're at 4.4 million years, and you've got an ape that's capable of walking bipedally on the ground, but it's really, really awkward when it's doing so. The trees are present, but they're going away as the Miocene draws to a close and the Pliocene comes to fruition, right? This is going to be the rise of the grasslands in places like Africa. After Ardipithecus ramidus, we see the rise of the Australopiths. Australopiths is a sort of group that contains all of the members of Australopithecus. So Australopithecus is an enormously speciose genus. What that means is that there are a ton of different species and specimens that belong to Australopithecus, the genus. And Australopithecus as a genus is just wickedly fascinating. So I'll pull down Australopithecus africanus here. This is Mrs. Ples, a famous fossil cranium from South Africa. And where Ardipithecus was found just in the east, Australopithecus starts to spread out into a bunch of different regions. In part, it is argued with the expansion of those grasslands. Now, when we look at Australopithecus, we're really fortunate, right? Everybody knows Australopithecus through Lucy, who was discovered in the 1970s by Johansen and colleagues. And when she was first discovered, the reason she's called Lucy is because they were playing, the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds on their record player. And when they discovered her, so they call her Lucy, and she's a female, so Lucy makes sense. But when you look at Lucy, we see a massive change. Lucy being an Australopith, and these characteristics exist in all members of Australopithecus, which is, well, although I'm showing you Mrs. Ples here, that's just because this is a really nice cranium to show you some characteristics of Australopithecus. Lucy is going to be the individual specimen that changes the game because, like Ardipithecus, it's not just a cranium, it's a skeleton. When we look at Lucy, we see a couple of really, really, really important things. Seth, can I ask you, what would you expect of a hominin that lives now fully on the grasslands, right? Or at least, for the most part in these grassland environments. What would you expect her to look like with regard to efficiency on two legs?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I mean, to be able to walk effectively, to be able to have enough brain capacity to procure resources. I don't know. What should I expect?
No, you nailed it. I mean, it's intuitive, right? If being bipedal is the more efficient way of moving and you're predisposed to being bipedal and your trees are disappearing, you would expect that by the time virtually all the trees are gone, you better be really good upright. You better be a really good biped. What you predicted is exactly what we found. When we looked at Lucy, from the neck down, her morphology, the physical characteristics, are basically just a slightly worse version of what we see in humans. And when I say slightly worse, I mean with regard to walking and running. She was really good at what she did, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the characteristics that make humans bipedal, as I said earlier, are that forwardly placed foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull, an S-shaped spine so that we can hold our bodies upright, a valgus knee, or a knee that comes in at an angle, again, to help bear our weight and transfer that weight over. A bowl-shaped pelvis, and then remember that short ilium and short ischium to pack those gluteal muscles on the sides, and specific characteristics with regard to the feet. So the big toe needs to be in line so you can roll that weight through and toe off, and you need to have 3 arches in the foot so that when you take those big hard steps while you're walking or running, shock is absorbed through your body, right? Chimpanzees don't have any of those characteristics. Ardipithecus has a few, namely a forwardly placed foramen magnum and a short ilium. But by the time we reach Australopithecus, Seth, all the characteristics for bipedalism are there. Again, just a slightly worse version of what we see in humans. When we look at Lucy, her pelvis is reminiscent, in breathtaking detail of a human's. The ilium is short. The ischium is short. She would have been able to pack those gluteal muscles on the side. She has a valgus knee, a knee that comes inward at an angle so that she can hold her body sort of in an upright column and effectively transfer that weight over. Her foramen magnum is sort of inferred on the basis of other Australopiths that also have her characteristics, so you know that you're looking at the same type of animal. It's forwardly placed. When you look at Australopithecus africanus here, it's directly forward, right? Certainly not what you see in something like a chimpanzee. So that leaves the question, okay, well, from Lucy's skeleton, we could see that she's got the right kind of knee, she's got the right kind of pelvis, she's got the right kind of skull, right? Again, inferring from other Australopiths that we had. But what about the feet? Because something that creationists complain about all the time is that Lucy didn't have any feet. There were no foot bones associated with Lucy, and that's correct. And this was something that creationists at the time latched onto, and they still latch onto it today, even though they shouldn't for reasons that I'll mention in a second. But there's this wonderful story about another pretty close by geographically team that was working near where Lucy was discovered in East Africa. And it's actually the Leakeys, right? they're hanging around in Olduvai Gorge, like around the Olduvai Gorge site. And the story goes that they're, ending the day. They've been looking for fossils. They would be the ones that would discover the first specimens of Paranthropus, as well as, Paranthropus boisei, as well as genus Homo, the very early members of genus Homo. But at the time, they're just kind of screwing around. They're ending their day, getting ready to head back to camp. And the story goes that they start to have a dung fight. Right, so I don't know if you've ever seen elephant poop, Seth, but it's very flaky, and like kind of like dirt clods, So they start throwing dirt clods, except it's poop, at each other. And the story goes that Mary Leakey, she comes over the corner and she's kind of like hiding, behind a ridge, and they look down. The team is all kind of looking down as they're hiding, and one of the teammates shouts out to Mary and is like, we need to stop. We found something. If memory serves, I think it was actually one of the Tanzanian workers. So they all stop, they walk over there, and there's a trackway of footprints cemented in the ground. And when you look at these footprints, Mary remarked when she looked at them, she's like, these look really human. But they weren't human. They were too small to be human. And the morphology, even at first glance, was just slightly off. Right? It was just slightly aberrant. The big toe's just a little bit off to the side. There's just the heel print is really, really deep. So they start to investigate these prints, and the site that they're actually at would come to be known as Laetoli. These are the Laetoli footprints. So what's fascinating about these prints is they tell us a lot about the lives that these Australopiths led. So we're in East Africa, so this is going to be Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, and this would come to be known once they radiometrically dated the site. That this is the same time as Australopithecus afarensis lived. And when you look at these footprints, you can see two individuals walking side by side. The smaller set of footprints is sort of walking, bow-legged like that, with each foot pointing outward, and the larger set of footprints is walking straight on. This is really cool because by the time these footprints were discovered, we were starting to pick up on the fact that Australopithecus is a genus. There are big versions and there are small versions of even, within species of Australopithecus like afarensis, suggesting that these guys were sexually dimorphic. The males were bigger than the females by quite a bit, more closer to gorillas than like humans today. So these footprints match those expectations. The males are huge, like twice the size of the females, which is the smaller one. And the way that we know that it's probably a female and not just a kid, which is, inevitably your next question, is because you get that pattern of those feet sort of tilting out to the side when an individual today, like if you test women today, when they're carrying something on their hip, right? So when you're carrying a load on your hip, you tend to bow your legs out like that to sort of account for that asymmetry in how you're bearing your weight. So, why would an Australopith be carrying something on their hip? What could they be carrying? Well, chimpanzee babies hold on to their moms' backs. But what happens when you have, a mom that isn't horizontal like this? They're vertical like this. They're walking upright. You can't hold on to the back anymore. You're a little baby. Where are your muscles? You can't just cling. So the mom has to hold the baby, holding it on her hip as she walks. That's the argument that's made. And when you look at the male that's walking side by side with her, you can see that there's a smaller set of tracks inside the male's footprints. And the argument has been made in the past that this is another Australopith and that it's a kid, like following along behind, these two adults. It reminds me of when I was a little kid, walking in the snow. I grew up in the Midwest. And when my dad and I would be out in the snow, he'd be taking these big steps and I would be walking inside his steps because it's easier than, walking and paving my own path being a little kid and the snow's really high. You might be asking, well, what are they walking in? And the way that they dated this site was through an ash layer because this massive volcanic eruption, approximately 3.4 million years earlier, had covered this region of East Africa in ash. And it was quite deep ash. And so it wasn't just Australopith footprints that they found, but it was all sorts of different animal footprints. And the nice thing about ash layers is you can date them directly. You can radiometrically date them directly because they have tiny little igneous rocks inside them in the ash layers. So what we had with this trail of footprints was, ostensibly a little family, walking along in an ash layer, going from point A to point B. And I think that's really familiar and really human sounding, right? It could be that they all walked separately. They walked along first the big male comes and the female, an hour later, and then, a kid afterwards, and that they weren't walking all as a group. But I think that doesn't match what we seem to be learning more and more about these guys, is that they were social, just like us. They would have been in groups. They would have been together, especially if disaster had struck like this. So then you look at these footprints, right? They got 3 arches, and the toe is almost as in line as in a human. Not quite, but it's close. And the way that they bore their weight, even though they had these 3 arches, just like a modern human, is intermediate in between chimpanzees and humans. It's transitional in the way that it bears its weight. And the way that they discovered this is they took casts of the Laetoli footprints, and then they took casts of chimpanzee footprints today. And then they had hunter-gatherers with no shoes make trackways in some synthetic ash, and they took casts of those, and then they compared the linear and then GM measurements. They did a GM analysis on these 3 sets of footprints, and they found that Laetoli was in between. So even though the morphology of the foot looks more like a human than like a chimp, the way that it's bearing its weight is still intermediate, right? And it's more towards a human, but it's still sort of more in the middle than the morphology itself. And then you might be thinking, well, how? Okay, the creationist comes and says, okay, so we got these footprints. How do you know that the Australopithecus made those footprints, right? What if they were just modern human footprints made 3.4 million years ago, and actually it wasn't that long ago, it was 6,000 years ago? And drawing the connection between Australopithecus afarensis and these footprints is not a fair thing to do, even though they were found really close to one another within a geographic sense. And to that I say, again, we have the feet of these things. A phenomenal specimen called Littlefoot, or STW573. This skeleton, and you're going to put a picture here, Seth, and when you go back and look at this, you're going to be like, oh my God, I didn't even know we had skeletons that complete. It's like a complete skeleton of Australopithecus africanus, a member of Australopithecus, and it matches, like the morphology that we have matches what we have of every other Australopith remain in the big characteristics of the bones that we have. And we have the remains of over 300 individuals from this genus. So what this tells us is that, one, we've been correct in assigning all of those others to Australopithecus. But the nice thing about this particular specimen is that part of the foot is preserved, and it's like a single chunk. It's like still articulated. And like when you look at the remains of this individual skeleton's foot, that toe is in line, right? It looks like the type of footprint that would have left the Laetoli prints. Not the human prints are not a good match for Laetoli. This foot is, suggesting that, again, we were correct, as we all tend to be, in assigning that footprint trail to Australopithecus. And of course, because we have this entire skeleton from a different member of Australopithecus, but an Australopith nonetheless, we can check what we said about Lucy. Does the entire genus have those characteristics that we originally said? Yes. It has the anterior foramen magnum. It has the bowl-shaped pelvis. It has the valgus knee. It has the S-shaped spine. Right? It has the right foot morphology. Again, it's more primitive or basal versions of what we see in a human, but they're there. This thing could not have been a quadruped when it came onto the ground, right? It had to have been bipedal, and its anatomy tells us that it was bipedal a lot.
Okay, so I just want to recap real fast. We're talking about, for lack of a better word, a split. We begin to see characteristics that we can recognize in humans in primates 7 million years ago. Am I tracking there? Were they primates at that point?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because remember, Seth, all apes are primates, all of them, right? All monkeys are primates, all lemurs are primates. Not all primates are apes, right? Lemurs aren't apes, but they all nest within primates generally. So you're dead on when you say that we see the first characteristics of a hominid, so the human-specific line 7 million years ago.
What about geography? Is this a specific part of the world that we're seeing a focused area?
Yeah, it's all in Africa.
Okay.
All of it.
All right.
These first hominids are showing up in East and South Africa and a little bit in Central.
We are all Africans. I always like that. Whenever you meet a racist, you're always like, maybe you want to do a genetic test on yourself, pal. Okay, so then if we skip forward a few million years, we're talking about primates, quadrupeds in the trees. When the trees begin to disappear and there are more flatlands, the ones who are more optimized for bipedalism and have larger brains to be able to survive without the trees, without the shelter of the trees, etc. Those are the ones who begin to procreate, and we begin to see bipedalism the order of the day. Is that close?
Yeah, yes, it's pretty close. Let me specify just a little bit. So I want to ask you a question because you're good at this. You made a mistake by being right the first. So let's say you've got a rainforest, right? And this is a rainforest 7 million years ago. And in this rainforest, you have 2 apes living there, 2 species of apes. One of the apes is a quadruped in the trees, so it walks on all 4s on top of the branches. And then one of the apes is upright in the trees, so it hangs below the branches like this. If you take away the trees, which of those two apes, the quadruped or the upright one in the trees, is going to be more predisposed to being upright on the ground?
The one who is predisposed to be upright in the trees, right?
Exactly. Yeah. If you have an ape that's upright in the trees and you take away the trees, it's going to be upright on the ground. We see this today, gibbons, and I'll give you a picture here, when they come down from the trees, even though they live in the trees like for their entire lives pretty much, when they do come down, they have to walk upright. So if you have an ape that's upright in the trees, which is like an advantageous way to move around in the trees because you hang below, you swing arm over arm, you brachiate. If you take away those trees, you're upright on the ground. So what you're seeing, the argument goes, and there are many hypotheses about these, this is the one that I like the best. If you have a rainforest in Africa and at the end of the Miocene, the forest starts to go away, you've got a bunch of different types of apes living in these trees. Some of them are upright in the trees, some of them are quadrupedal in the trees. But you take away those rainforests, the ones that are upright in the trees are going to be upright on the ground. They're going to be more predisposed to be able to capitalize on their morphology that already existed, to become more efficient at that bipedalism that they can already do, but really poorly.
So when they first start walking upright, I say first, in that the first series of the first few thousand years or whatever, the feet are more awkward, the pelvises aren't optimized, the spine, etc. But the ones who survive actually had, for lack of a better word, they were born with a better model for the foot, the pelvis, and the spine, and then they begin to reproduce. Is that close?
Yeah, let's say, again, let's look at our same population that we were just looking at. The trees start to disappear and our little upright ape in the trees comes down to the ground. We got a little family of them, let's say a population of like 10. And of those 10 apes, they have to come down from their few trees that are remaining to move from tree patch to tree patch, because we're living in one tree patch, we eat all the fruit, we need to move to the next one so that we can survive. But the distance between our tree patch and the next one is a mile. And on that mile of open grassland, there's all sorts of big prehistoric predators that are very happy to eat an ape that just so happened to venture to the ground, because no apes are particularly quick on the ground because we evolved in the trees. We're great in the trees, but not on the ground. So we have to move from point A to point B. In that family of 10 individuals, some are going to be slightly different than others with regard to all sorts of different physical characteristics, just like humans are today. And the ones that are slightly better at moving across that open, flat grassland, if a big group of predators decides to attack our little family of 10, the ones that they're going to get are going to be the ones that are worse at moving bipedally, even just for that brief distance. So you see an enormous amount of natural selection right off the bat as these guys are trying to get around on this new landscape.
And then the brains begin to get bigger. Is this like the smarter ones were also able to survive? So those who had been, I don't know, is it random? Are these characteristics if you have a family of 10 and some feet are better than others? It's just this, genes kind of moving around in a random way?
Yeah, so we're actually at a really interesting point in time with these Australopiths, right? Because their brains are a little bit bigger than chimps, but not by much. We haven't seen a massive explosion in brain case size yet. And what's weird about that is that, well, it was weird to the people who discovered it because it's not intuitive. You would expect that bipedalism and big brains would evolve at the same time in tandem, rising up to the human level. But what we actually see is that those trees disappear first, and you don't need a big brain to be bipedal. You need to be bipedal to be bipedal. So what we see is that bipedalism is evolving faster than those larger brains, right? The brains are getting a little bit bigger, but really not by much. It didn't seem like smarts was super important at this very early juncture. It seems like at first it was just like, can you get from point A to point B? Evolution is selecting very quickly on what you need to survive in that environment, not what would be helpful. You know what I mean? It's, to use Forrest's terminology, it's like survival of the okayest. So we're getting selection for these characters of walking upright, but those big brains are lagging behind. They're just a little bit bigger. A chimp, for example, is about 300 cc's or cubic centimeters. A human is 1,200, right? 4 times bigger. And then in between, like in volume, I should say, and surface area and things like that. And Australopithecus, these Australopiths are about 550. So bigger than what we see in a chimp, really almost double what you see in a chimp, in the smaller brained chimps, but nowhere near humans, not even halfway to humans yet.
All right. So as you say, I'm a gentle and modern ape, and I'm looking back, seeing similarities in these ancient fossils, etc. What's the next progression? What happens after I become a biped out in the African savanna?
Yeah. So, by approximately 3.3 million years ago, you're an upright ape. You're an Australopith, but you're still kind of a pinhead. right? I mean, you look at these guys and their brains are nothing to write home about. Again, like that 550 is pushing it. That's what you see in the bigger males. But now you're good when you're on the savannah. You're upright. And you're still maintaining some characteristics that are really primitive, right? You've still got really long arms, really curved fingers, and really mobile shoulders, so that even though you're walking from patch of trees to forage, you don't have fire yet. And you're a big, slow ape that lives on the ground. Where do you think you want to sleep at night?
Probably up high.
Probably up high. So evolution is going to maintain those characteristics that are going to keep you from getting eaten when the sun sets. So these Australopiths still have characteristics that they maintain from their ape ancestry, and we have those today. We don't live in the trees, and yet we still maintain these super flexible bodies that allow us, when we want to climb better than almost every mammal. Right? We're not better than most primates, but we're better than most mammals. So these Australopiths are living on this landscape, 3.3 million years ago. They're still spending quite a bit of time in the trees, namely to forage and to sleep. At least that's the logical conclusion of this version of the savanna hypothesis that I'm presenting to you. But they still need to be able to move upright. And as they're living on this landscape, moving from place to place, they've started to notice that there are resources that they can exploit, but not with their own bodies, right? This is something that chimpanzees can already do. So this isn't shocking, but it turns out that the way that trees work is that there are some trees that are going to have fruits that have really hard exteriors, or they produce nuts that have really hard exteriors. And it's tough to get at the part inside that you want to get at. Chimpanzees are smart enough to look at that and say, well, I can't break it with my jaws, but I bet if I take that big rock and I smack it into this nut, it'll break. So they do it, they smack it into the nut, and the nut sinks into the ground, and they're like, there needs to be a rock on the other side too. So chimpanzees are capable of taking a nut and putting it on top of a rock, their anvil, and then taking a hammerstone and smashing the top and cracking the nut to get the food inside. An Australopiths were capable of this too. In fact, remember, their brains are a little bit bigger than what we see with chimpanzees. So as it turns out, at 3.3 million years ago, when we've got these Australopiths living on the landscape, walking bipedally with a slightly bigger brain, we start to find stone tools. At 3.3 million years ago at Laetoli, a pretty famous site, we find stone tools. They're really, really primitive, but they are more advanced than what chimpanzees use today. So you might be thinking, what are they using these tools for, right? 3.3 million years ago, what could they possibly be using these tools for? Well, maybe cracking open nuts. Or maybe they'd figured out that you can crack open more than just nuts with a big rock. You can crack open bones. And when you crack open bones, inside those bones, there's marrow that most animals on the savanna aren't going to bother with. Hyenas will. But a hyena isn't the predator that kills everything. If a lion, eats everything off of a corpse and then leaves, there's a skeleton left behind, and you as a hominin are capable of chasing off vultures, walking up to it and picking up a bone. And you now know, you're smart enough to know that there is marrow inside that bone. And maybe that happened, you can see this logically, right, playing out. You've got a hominin that's Australopithecus walking along, and they see a bone, and it's been trampled by a wildebeest. They pick it up, and there's stuff in there that they can eat. And then they put two and two together, just as a chimp is capable of doing, right? And say, okay, well, there's food in this. I can't open this by myself. They see other complete non-broken bones next to it. But if you slam it on the ground, like in Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey, it'll break. And if it's not brittle enough, if you're not strong enough to break it yourself, you can take one of those rocks that you've already been using to crack open nuts and crack open this bone too, and get at the marrow inside. Now, there's a really critical step that is going on here, Seth, right? Which is that bone marrow is energetically a powerhouse. All organic material is, which is what, or all animal material, I guess I should say, is, which is why even herbivores across the animal kingdom will opportunistically eat other animals if they can. Like you can see a horse chomp a little baby chicken. They'll eat a chick, if a chick wanders in front of it. Chimpanzees don't eat a lot of meat, but they do hunt actively meat. They hunt monkeys. They hunt little antelopes that live in the rainforest. Females will specifically sharpen sticks with their teeth and spear bush babies in little cavities of trees that they can't reach with their hands and eat that meat. Gorillas will opportunistically eat. They won't hunt like chimpanzees do, but they'll opportunistically eat eggs and little lizards and things like that. Same with orangutans, same with gibbons. And what happens when you start doing this consistently is you raise the amount of energy that your body has available. You expand your energy pool. Now, the most expensive organ in your entire body, there's two really expensive systems in your body. The first is your gastrointestinal system, and that's because it's quite large. But the other one is your brain. Your brain eats a lot, right? It takes anywhere from 10 to 20% of your daily intake calorically goes just to keeping your brain functioning. So all organisms are limited by how big, in how big they can grow their brain by the environment in which they live, by the food that they have available to them. So for instance, let's say you have a horse, right? Horses eat like alfalfa and stuff like that. And one day a horse is born with a brain that's, 20% bigger than the average horse's brain. If it's living in the wild, that horse is probably not going to experience a selection for that big brain. It's probably going to die young because that brain is super expensive, and horses eat alfalfa and grass. It can't fuel that big brain. You have to have a diet that's able to support a big brain, which is why virtually every animal that has a big brain, with a few exceptions, tends to incorporate some amount of animal product into their diets. So what happens when you have an Australopith living on a landscape that's just figured out how to explode the metabolic budget that they have available to them? Well, now the individuals that are born with slightly larger brains can fuel them. Their brains are actually able to provide a benefit to them in their environment because they're now exploiting, more calorically dense resources. So now when you're born with a bigger brain, you can innovate, right? You can innovate with better tools to procure even more animal resources, which means you can grow an even bigger brain, which means you can innovate, which means that you can procure even more animal resources, which means you can get an even bigger brain, which means that you can innovate even more and procure even more animal resources. When tools enter the scene and start to open up this dietary niche for hominids, that's when you see the brain case size explode.
I want to come back to brain case size. Tools. When you say tools, I mean, the creationist might argue, well, it was a randomly shaped rock that looked like what do you mean by tool so many million years ago?
Yeah, so a tool is a rock that's been intentionally shaped. And when I say intentionally shaped, I mean they exhibit percussive fracture patterns that can only be formed if you have something that is picking them up and smashing them together over and over and over again in specific ways. A rock rolling down a hill cannot form those percussive patterns. It's very specific to the type of percussive action that requires basically something picking them up and saying, okay, I'm going to do this over and over and over and over and over again.
So because this was not a natural phenomenon, we can infer intentionality. This was purposefully done.
Yeah, purposefully done. It was done. I would prefer the word intentionally, because purposefully sort of implies that they're, saying, oh, I'm going to do this for this purpose, which maybe they were. But we also see baby chimpanzees today. They pick up a rock and they intentionally smack it on the ground a bunch of times. Maybe they're not doing it for a purpose. They're doing it because it's fun, right? That's how this starts, though, is that you've got an individual that tries something, just because, why not? And they realize that there is an advantage to doing that. And that's how tools enter into the culture of a given social animal's population, right? Chimpanzees today use all sorts of different tools, right? They don't just use rocks. They use all sorts of different sticks and leaves and vegetation and pieces of grass to do all sorts of different jobs within the environments in which they live. And the types of toolboxes that chimpanzees use differ depending on the population of chimpanzees that you're looking at, because they've developed many of them independently. So the same would be true for Australopiths. And what's fascinating is that we know that chimpanzees use tools today. We see them using tools, right? This is common knowledge and easy to see. Although it was groundbreaking when Jane Goodall, published on it in the 1900s, right? It was new then, 1960s, I believe. But what that means is that because we see the patterns that rocks form when we intentionally make them, or when a chimpanzee smashes a rock onto another rock, you can actually go back in time and see the archaeological history of chimpanzees at sites that they live at today. You can go back 1,000 years, dig down into the soil. You can pull up rocks that same population of chimpanzees, tens of generations earlier, used to make tools then, right? Used as tools, I should say, then. So it's the same principle. We know what fracture patterns form stone tools today. So when we find them in the past, and we know that nature can't produce these types of stone fractures, right? We know that they were made by someone, not just something.
So here we are. We're optimizing we are Well, let's say natural selection is optimizing us to be bipedal. Our brains are growing. Our diets are supporting that. I guess, are we already covered in hair, or were we always covered in hair? And when does that begin to change? And does any of this relate to the next skull? I'm fascinated by your skull collection, Erika. What's the next step? What happens?
Yeah, I mean, so you've got, 3.3 million years ago, we've got the Lamecqui stone tool culture. And very, very quickly, that stone tool culture is going to explode in tandem with brain case size, right? So hominins that live shortly, some of them are contemporaneous with, some of them are very shortly after. But genus Homo is going to come on the scene roughly 2.8 million years ago. So about 500,000 years after Australopiths first start using tools. And I know there are going to be pedants out there. It might be Neanderthals, but they're very similar. So we'll put a pin in that. Genus Homo is going to come along, and Homo is going to be discovered first by the Leakeys again at Olduvai Gorge. And they discovered stone tools there first, but they discovered them there with a much more primitive hominin known as Paranthropus. They called him Zinjanthropus at the time. I mentioned this in our last talk. But you've got this stone tool and this really primitive looking hominin, and then they discover Homo, right? They discover Homo habilis, to be precise. Then, you got one skull that's bigger brained and looks more like a human, and then you have a smaller brained one that looks much more, apish. And they're like, okay, genus Homo probably made the tools at Olduvai Gorge, and these stone tools are different from the ones at Lamecqui. They're more advanced. These stone tools they're starting to be shaped a little bit. They're Oldowan stone tools. And they're nothing to write home about, but they're certainly more advanced than the ones that you saw at Lamecqui. When you look at Homo habilis' brain, it's bigger too. Now, the lower end of Homo habilis' brain dips, and I'm going to give you a chart here, Seth, to put up so you can see what's overlapping with what. But the lower end of Homo habilis' brain case range is dipping into the higher end of Australopithecus, but it's like a little Venn diagram, right? Where they overlap is small but present. But Homo habilis is starting to push the boundary. The brains are getting bigger, and the tools are getting more advanced, right? Homo habilis is going to dominate the landscape for a little bit, and then after it, maybe contemporaneous with it, like the relationships are kind of unclear, but you have an even bigger brained, older member of genus Homo, Homo rudolfensis. So to put this into perspective, Australopithecus' brain is only getting up to 550 cc's max. Homo habilis' brain can push it, can get quite a bit bigger at like roughly 720 cc's, right? Give or take. And then Homo rudolfensis comes along, it's younger than habilis, and its brain reaches into the 800 cc's. So we're starting to see this ramping up of brain case size along with the ramping up of stone tool use. Now, as far as are these guys covered with hair, we're not really sure, right? Hair can fossilize, but not well. We definitely know when the hair has disappeared, though. And when the hair has disappeared is when we reach the hominin that follows Homo rudolfensis, who lived about 2 million years ago. And around that same time, we see the emergence of Homo erectus. Homo erectus was first discovered in Asia. But Homo erectus is fascinating because, again, like I said, they discovered in Asia first. And they're like, humans evolved in Asia. But shortly after it was discovered in Asia, they start to find every single one of the more primitive hominins in Africa, which means that at some point, humans, had evolved to a point in Africa where they left. Now, there's something that's really difficult about leaving Africa, and that's that you have to go through a lot of desert to get out of there, which means that, it means a couple of things. One, you have to be really, really, really good at not overheating, something that fur is going to make very difficult. Two, you need to be able to carry your water with you, because if you're crossing a big desert, you're basically going to dehydrate to death if you don't have a means of carrying your water. And three, you need to be really pretty intelligent so you can plot your route through the desert to leave Africa. Now, the fact that we have Homo erectus outside of Africa by almost 2 million years, by 1.95, means that Homo erectus, existed and had a brain that was large enough to start to plot this kind of thing out, certainly by 2 million years ago. It's living at the same time as some of the earlier members of genus Homo, and even Australopiths are still around, because something doesn't go extinct just because it leaves a more successful, quote unquote, descendant. Wolves are the ancestors of dogs, but we have dogs and wolves today still. In the same way, genus Homo descends from Australopithecus, but they still live at the same time for a really long time during the fossil record. So what was it about Homo erectus? What made it so good at getting out of Africa? Well, when we look at the morphology of this thing, it becomes pretty obvious, right? The brain. There's a huge difference in the brain case size of Australopithecus and Homo erectus. I've got these two right here, and it serves to it serves, got those two right here, and I should probably show you as well. Here's Homo habilis, smaller than Homo erectus, but bigger than Australopithecus. And then we have Rudolphins. Hold on, I'll make this better. Geez. And then we have Rudolfensis, which is even closer, even closer to Homo erectus. And then we reach Homo erectus, right? So those brain case sizes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time you reach this guy, the first hominin to leave Africa, brains are big. And because we also find Homo erectus in very cold places, it serves to reason that these guys were also wearing clothes. Now, how can we tell that they were wearing clothes just because we find them in cold places? How do we know that they didn't just still have hair when they went to these cold places, and they figured out how to thermoregulate when they were in the desert? Well, when you run a phylogeny, so a family tree at the species level, on the difference between human head lice and body lice and pubic lice, what you find is that they split right around the time that Homo erectus leaves Africa, which suggests that they weren't able to live on our body hair anymore because we didn't have it. They were isolated to our heads, the tops of our heads, and our pubic region, where we still had hair. And that's because the hair was gone and the clothes arrived so that we could live in these cold regions.
So what are we talking about? Are you talking about animal skins? When you say clothing, of course, when some people are thinking about Gucci and Louis Vuitton. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think we are talking about animal skins, right? They're not weaving anything yet. So we suggest that they're probably taking the skins off of the animals that they're hunting. And hunting is argued to be one of the big innovations of Homo erectus, in part because their brain size is, of course, exploding, but also because their bodies have changed. We've got bipedalism on the scene by the time Australopithecus is there. Those guys are walking upright every time they come to the ground. But when you look at Homo erectus, and we've got this wonderful skeleton called Tchadensis that I've had the pleasure of seeing and touching myself out of Kenya, that this thing has the proportions of virtually identical to a modern human. It's got long legs, shorter arms, right? Its body is built for long distances, which is perfect for a hominin that wants to leave Africa. And it's also perfect for the type of hunting that humans are really, really good at, to the exclusion of almost every other animal on the planet. We're persistence hunters. So we're not fast, Seth, right? Like you and me, we could be the best runners in the world. Usain Bolt, right, could try to run down a gazelle. He's not going to catch it. In fact, Usain Bolt is going to be outrun by a house cat. So how do we hunt? And the answer is the earliest humans were built for not speed, but endurance. We don't have hair anymore, right, at the time that Homo erectus is here, which means that, we're basically baking in the sun. We need to be able to cool ourselves off. And that selective pressure led to the development of more sweat glands or eccrine glands. We have 3 times the amount of sweat glands compared to a chimpanzee. So the persistence hunting hypothesis argues that we were basically honed for living and thermoregulating to be, under the hot sun on the savanna. But those same adaptations allowed us to cool off better than any other animal that's out there, pretty much, because we can sweat and cool our bodies, which means that we could see a gazelle and start to chase it. And the gazelle will, immediately run past, out of our range. It's running fast, it's running quickly, and eventually we can't see it anymore. But we're intelligent. Our brains have already gotten big. And this is 2 million years ago we're talking. Really 1.6 when we're looking at Erika boy, the Turkana boy that I just mentioned, 1.6, 1.7. So, the gazelle's out of sight, but your brain is big, right? You're able to track it. We're not using our sense of smell. We're using our eyes. We're following these little clues. And people hunt like this today still. There are persistence hunters in South Africa that still hunt like this. So you follow the gazelle. You can't see it, but you follow the tracks that it makes in the dirt. You follow the way that it's broken vegetation, and you come upon it again. And the gazelle sees you, and it runs again. It's like, how did this thing catch up to me? But you're still following, right? It's running, you're following it, and you don't stop, right? This thing keeps trying to stop and cool off, but you don't have to because you're sweating the whole time, and you're Homo erectus, so you're probably carrying your water with you. You already eat a lot of meat. You know that organs can hold water. We use water skins for millennia. You're probably carrying your water along with you as you go, or where the spots to get water are. So you're following this gazelle, and this dance continues for hours, where it stops, you catch up again, it runs, it stops, you catch up again, and so on and so forth, until eventually the sun has baked this thing. It hasn't been able to stop for water. It hasn't been able to cool its body down. Meanwhile, you haven't even overheated, and you're carrying a big sharp stick. So eventually you come up on it and it's laying exhausted, and all you have to do is make the throw. And you've gotten meat for the entire tribe again. Right. So you're built for persistence hunting. You're capable of doing it. This is something that works. Like I said, we see people doing it today. And so now you're fueling that feedback loop of the big brain, to grow it even larger and innovate even more. All the while you're starting to get curious as to what's north past that big impenetrable desert. And you're thinking to yourself, I can carry my water when I'm hunting this gazelle. Why don't we just go? And we'll carry our water with us. We'll drag our food with us. And that's what ends up happening. Homo erectus penetrates up through the desert, the Sahara, and up north through the Levant. And they break into Europe, and they break into East Asia. And they look very, very similar to us. But at the same time, when you look at the skull of this thing, you can recognize it as human, but the brow ridge is so chimp-like. The teeth are enormous. It's prognathic. The brain case is big, but it's still not as big as ours, right? This thing would have looked really, really apish in a lot of different ways. And the body hair is disappearing, but it's probably not completely gone. So, you got this kind of shaggy looking human, with these big, brutish features. That's brilliant, penetrating out into the rest of the world. And everywhere these populations of Homo erectus stop, and they settle, and then another group, being the curious apes that we are, decide to strike out again. So it's leaving these little populations of itself everywhere it goes. And those populations are now subject to completely different pressures than, the Homo erectus that was left back in Africa, right? You get Neanderthals evolve in Europe. These big, robust, cold adapted is the argument that's made, hominids that are ideal for living in these colder conditions. They got a big nose to warm up the air. They've got big, robust bodies for, short sprinting over rocky terrain. You've got another group of Homo erectus that settles out in East Asia that's going to eventually beget Denisovans, another really mysterious, enigmatic group of hominins that lives in these kind of crazy conditions. Homo erectus is going to persist there. The argument goes that Homo erectus is also the ancestor of Homo floresiensis, those little 3-foot tall hobbit hominins that are on the island of Flores that you can only get to if you've got you get washed there by a storm, or if you row there, you get on a log and you push yourself there. Now, Homo erectus is enormously innovative, and it's the parent population, the parent species of all of these different hominins that evolve outside of Africa. All the while, there's another group of Homo erectus still in Africa that is continuing to change in this harsh environment there. And it's going to stay lanky, and it's going to stay, long and lean. And that's going to be the population of Homo erectus that's eventually going to lead to Homo sapiens. And what's insane is that all of these populations are developing technologies, right? They're starting to figure out, they know how to use fire at this point in time. They're carrying their water around, like I said. They're starting to figure out, more advanced weapons. They're using the Acheulean tool industry, which is this beautiful type of tool that's napped, and it pierces the skin of animals extremely well. They're able to collect ocean resources like mollusks and fish, right? And we find these in their camps, the bones of fish cooked, and bones of the teeth, pharyngeal teeth of fish cooked in Homo erectus fireplaces and hearths. And this is happening everywhere. Hominins are unstoppable. This big brain meat feedback loop has just, launched them into the stratosphere, and their bodies are perfectly built for travel. I mean, it's the perfect storm that only emerged because you got this curious Australopithecus that decides to smash a bone open.
I don't want to digress too much, but we also see as a survival mechanism more than just the body characteristics, behaviors, specifically in regard to social groups, right? I mean, those who are going it alone on the African savanna are probably more easy meat, where those who coalesced and created tribes. And we talk a lot about modern day tribalism and these sort of, they're leftovers from our evolutionary past. Would that be a fair way to say it? I mean, we are tribal primates.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, this is something that's far older than Homo erectus. I mean, we see this in chimps. Chimpanzees today live in groups that will systematically patrol their territory. And if they encounter lone members outside of the group, they'll kill him. And they don't just kill him in a simple way. They tear him to pieces. They gouge out his eyes. They rip off his testicles. I mean, they're really ruthless. And these chimpanzees, if they find out that there's an entire population living in an adjacent society or in an adjacent territory, they'll get the gang together, they'll go into that adjacent territory and wipe out the adjacent population. I mean, they do it on purpose, and they specifically will not wipe out females, right? They'll try to incorporate the females into their group, but the males are toast.
So before the move up into Europe, I mean, we're talking about early primates, evidence of early primates acting in social groups for survival and to thrive well into what, millions of years ago?
Yeah, I mean, 7 million years ago, the common ancestor of humans and chimps. And we see this behavior in humans and chimps, right? That the tribalism exists in humans and chimpanzees and bonobos, which suggests that since it's in both of us now, it's much more reasonable to propose that it emerged in our common ancestor and we retained it, as compared to saying we both independently evolved it, which meant that every single hominin group that we've been talking about along the way is a social, tribal, vengeful, compassionate animal that is capable of immense cruelty and also immense kindness. I mean, we see in these early hominins that leave in Homo erectus, the first hominin that leaves Africa. Forrest talks about this example all the time, but it bears repeating. We have a cranium, a skull from one of these guys, and it's a gummer, right? So it's lost all its teeth, and it lost all its teeth pretty early. And then the mandible fused around where the sockets for the teeth used to be. If you don't have any teeth, you can't eat. If you can't chew your own food, you die, right? So what that means is that this guy lost all his teeth and survived for years, cared for by other members of his group. There's no other way he could have survived, right? He relied on his group to chew his food for him and keep him going, right? We're talking about a hominin, we're talking about this guy, right? This guy's caring for its sick. This guy's making sure that the members of his group that are, infirm or otherwise, differently abled are managing to live as long as anybody else. Because they love them, right? At the same time, we find evidence on some of these hominins. There's arguments made for Neanderthal remains out of Sima de los Huesos, the site, that have specific head trauma wounds that show they were murdered, right? I mean, these guys they're us. And in a way, chimpanzees are us too. I mean, or we're them, or these characteristics are older than both of us, which is my opinion personally. They're just amplified in humans.
Just classic in-grouping and out-grouping. And I don't mean to say that social in-grouping is indigenous or exclusive to primates, but I mean, I'm most interested in primates. And then, of course, that brings me to the next evolution in our journey toward modern day, toward the Homo sapien, I guess. What happens next, Erika?
Yeah, I mean, so you got this guy, right? You got Neanderthals, and these guys are really phenomenal. They look really similar to erectus in a lot of ways, but in other ways they're pretty different. They're different in the teeth. Their brains are a lot bigger. Neanderthals actually, their brains got larger than ours did. They got even bigger brains than us, which is kind of crazy to think about. And it tells us a lot about how it's not necessarily the size of the brain that matters, but how it's organized, because we're here and they're not. So clearly we were doing something right.
Give me a time frame real fast when you say Neanderthals. Place that in the timeline for us.
Yeah, of course. So Homo erectus leaves Africa 2 million years ago, and it establishes these populations all over the world. The old world, I should say. It's not made it overseas to North and South America, but it's dropping populations in Europe that are going to evolve into Neanderthals around 800,000 to 400,000 years ago. So under 1 million. These populations are something else. The Homo erectus 2 million years ago that made it to Europe is Homo erectus by 800,000 years ago. In Asia, Homo erectus is persisting as its own thing, and it's also leaving Denisovans around the same time. Just under 1 million years, you've got Denisovans in Asia, you've got Neanderthals in Europe, you've got Homo floresiensis, those little 3-foot-tall hobbit guys are in the islands of Flores of Indonesia. And then back in Africa, you've still got Homo erectus persisting, and eventually at approximately 300,000 years ago, so younger than Neanderthals, you start to see the characteristics that define Homo sapiens from Homo erectus in East Africa, right around modern-day Ethiopia. And this hominin, Homo sapiens, is going to leave Africa again. What's cool is that we have evidence that Homo sapiens tried to leave Africa several times, right? We have these incursions where we find Homo sapiens, just outside Africa in the Middle East at like 100, 200,000 years ago, thereabouts. And then it disappears from the region, almost like Homo sapiens is getting out, failing at establishing a population, or perhaps being beaten out by other hominins that already live there. But by 70,000 years ago, under 100,000 years ago, where all of these other hominins are still living in, their relative regions, Homo sapiens, our species, which is defined very specifically by a chin, so specifically this, and I'll get my skulls to show you.
Just a sentence you don't hear every day. I'm going to get my skulls to show you, but that's what I love about you. Go ahead.
Yeah. When we're defining modern Homo sapiens to the exclusion of all these other big-brained hominins that are using a lot of the same tools at the time, there are only a couple of physical characteristics that make us Homo sapiens and make them something else. The first is we got little bitty teeth. Even compared to these other guys, our teeth are smaller. We have a chin. So when I hold these two side by side, you can see this little bony shelf here that Neanderthals don't have. Their mandible just ends on a cliff, right? Whereas ours jets out into a little chin. We have really rounded skulls, rounded crania, I guess I should say, compared to other hominins. So when you look at our skull, it makes this nice round globular shape. Whereas with Neanderthals, they have a skull that is long and low. It sort of stretches out backwards. They have a skull that's long and low, where it stretches out backwards, almost like you've taken a human skull, pinched it, and pulled it backwards, right? So humans have that really round one. Neanderthals don't. And then when you look at their faces, Homo sapiens has a forehead, right? If you tried to put a ball cap on this Neanderthal, they don't have a forehead to hold it there. It's going to fly off in the wind. Whereas humans have really expanded that frontal lobe upwards, right? We've got this massive forehead that we can fit a ball cap on our head, and our skulls are sort of short. And the argument goes that Neanderthals were brilliant, right? Like they had these big brains and they were capable of a lot, but that the parts of their brains that they expanded were different than the parts of the brains that Homo sapiens would expand. So Neanderthals would expand the occipital region, this region in the back, part of the reason why they got that long, low skull. They would have kicked our butts in any kind of like hand-eye coordination-based sport, which would made them probably incredible hunters. But their higher executive functions were less developed, that's your argument, than Homo sapiens, which really put a lot of effort into expanding that frontal lobe, which is like critical thinking and things of that nature. The argument goes that as Homo sapiens leaves Africa about 70,000 years ago is when it's finally successful at reaching all of these other locations. And very shortly after Homo sapiens shows up in Europe, for example, Neanderthals disappear forever. They go extinct. Homo sapiens makes it there at like 45,000 years ago. Neanderthals are gone by 40, right? We do the same thing out east. We do the same thing when we reach Indonesia. Where Homo sapiens goes, silence follows. Communities of these other hominids disappear. Now, we're not sure whether or not there's a comparison that can be drawn to the arrival of Homo sapiens and the extinction of these other hominins, like because we're trying to kill them, right? The alternative explanation is that we're arriving in these locations as the climate is changing. That's part of what's allowing us to sort of make it into these new zones with relative ease. That might be what finally let us get there. But as we're getting there, humans have a very different social organization that we can tell from the genetics of Neanderthals versus humans, right? We know that we organized ourselves differently because Neanderthals were super inbred at the end of their tenure. Humans were not. We lived according to our genetics in really big groups that collaborated and cooperated, whereas Neanderthals lived in smaller groups that were kind of isolated from one another, which meant that when the climate changed and humans rolled up into the area, we were maybe just better equipped to deal with the change because of our big groups, better critical thinking, and propensity to innovate as compared to Neanderthals. And they went extinct and we didn't.
Well, stupid question. How did we get from that continent to this continent?
Yeah, I mean, as the ice ages come and go, as glacial incursions, reach down into, up from the poles, certain regions in the north freeze. And the argument goes is that there's a land bridge that connects just the very, very western portion of the United States, of Alaska, with the very eastern portion of Russia. So that the hominins that were up there could basically take this land bridge, walk across all the way over to North America, and then down and expand outwards, from like 20, 30,000 years ago to present. But there are arguments, and I don't know how much weight these hold because it's, I study the more distant past than recent humans and recent human settlements. That's not really my area. I study the more apey looking things. But there are arguments that go that you may have had humans, Homo sapiens, getting into North and South America even earlier than like 20 to 30,000 years ago. And there's even a claim that is not super well supported, in my opinion, that there's evidence of humans using tools there like 100,000 years ago, in which case it wouldn't have been humans. It wouldn't have been Homo sapiens. We were still in Africa. It would have been something else that managed to make their way there and then not establish a population and die out.
So many of the problems that we have as gentle and modern apes are actually evidence that we did evolve. Specifically, we're talking about the large skull, the big brain case, the heavier part of the, our torsos and whatnot, and the stresses that those put on bodies that weren't originally, accommodating those types of things. You want to speak to how the big brains of modern day humans actually reveals that we are evolved?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just big brains, right? We're losing our wisdom teeth. This is something that every previous hominin had and always had. The wisdom teeth are disappearing in humans because we're not using them as much. Why do we have a tailbone that looks exactly like a chimpanzee's tailbone, that looks exactly like a gorilla's and an orangutan's and a gibbon's, if all of us didn't descend from something that used to have a tail, right? You could just put a spur there, but no, we actually have tail vertebrae. They're just tiny and they help hold up our pelvic floor, but this is developmentally something that used to be a tail, right? We have the same hands. Our hands have the primitive proportions of earlier apes, right? This long thumb and shorter fingers. This looks like a proconsul hand. It's just slightly more dexterous thanks to our larger brains. We have tons of different random features that are super primate-y, right? Like I mentioned earlier, we're able to hold our hands directly above our head, which is really beneficial to us, but this shows up first in very, very primitive apes for suspension below the branches. We have all of the same regions of the brain that a chimpanzee has. We just emphasize them in different ways. We have all of the same bones and muscles as these guys do. We just emphasize them in different ways. We're a modified Miocene ape. And I think that's super wonderful in a lot of different ways. I mean, I find it absolutely awe-inspiring. I think that's humbling, but in the most wonderful way, because in the same way that it's humbling, it's sort of, I don't think of it as lowering us to the level of everything else. I think of it as elevating everything to our level and seeing this as a beautifully connected tree of life, of which we get to be a part.
If I share that photograph of the human finger and the chimp finger that shows the fingerprint, was it a chimp that had the fingerprint? You've probably seen it floating around. Yeah. That connects us to the other primates, yes?
Well, yeah, they have fingerprints. We have fingerprints, right? I mean, they have fingernails. We have fingernails. They grow, in bonobos, which are close relative to chimps, they grow head hair longer than the hair on the rest of their bodies. We have the same amount of body hairs, especially folks with European ancestry to some degree, right? Is that we have the same amount of hairs on our bodies. They're just finer, right? Like if you thickened up my arm hair, it would look like a chimp arm. And it's just, everything about us is just a tweaked version of them.
Well, this is what happens when I contact my friend Erika and say, hey, can we chat for 45 minutes? Because it's never 45 minutes.
It's never 45 minutes.
I can't recall a conversation where I've seen a more clear connecting of the dots in regard to human evolution, which was the goal. So I'm happy to spend the lengthy amount of time. I'm going to go and donate to your channel for the time that you gave to us. Let me support you in some way. Let me give back. Let me bless you in the Lord, Erika, for your time. Any final thoughts? We went through the list of skulls, etc., but is there anything we missed, or you want to put a cap on it? What do you think?
I just want to sort of summarize that we've walked through 7 million years of history, and insofar as one can briefly touch on them, briefly touched on early hominins like Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus, and we've talked about the Australopiths, and we've talked about the rise of genus Homo. We completely skipped Paranthropus because we didn't have time, but this is another group of hominins that was upright just like we are, but they sort of maintained those small brains, and they've lived alongside genus Homo for millions of years. We've talked about what changed and when it changed, and how this was set out as a prediction before a single hominin fossil was ever discovered and formally talked about. by Darwin and Huxley in the mid to late 1800s. That's how science operates. We had this very clear prediction. Do we see morphologic change over geologic time of an ancient Miocene ape moving up to anatomically modern Homo sapiens? The answer is yes, and then some. We see the emergence of the traits that are required for bipedalism emerge slowly over geologic time, mosaics on mosaics in different organisms as we move up to Australopithecus. By then, we've got bona fide bipeds, and we start to see the emergence of big brains alongside them, right? These brains emerging and developing at the same time as we're seeing the advancement of stone tools and the emergence of omnivory and hunting in humans and in hominids before us. And this is all easily accessible to anybody who's curious about it, and wonderfully confirms predictions made, centuries ago by people who all they had was a hypothesis. And they said, if we're right and humans evolved from a more basal ape, this is what it should look like. And that has come to pass, and every single year is cemented further and further and further by additional discoveries by hardworking and passionate people that I am, so lucky to call colleagues. I
am into the audiobook, the book Sapiens. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Is there a book? I just want to try to hone things down, but a lot of people may not be visual learners or audio learners. Maybe they're readers. Is there a book that sort of summarizes much of this?
Gosh, human evolution is so complicated. It depends on what part you're interested in learning about. So if you want to learn about the bipedalism stuff that I've talked about, First Steps by De Silva is wonderful. He studies specifically the evolution of bipedalism and specifically of hominid feet up through time, and basically goes through what I've talked about here, but in far more detail, and then sort of halts it as we get up to Homo erectus because everything's bipedal and really, really good at it by that point. If you want to talk about the period of time that's before the split of humans and chimpanzees and how we still bear all of the characters that makes an ape, and that makes a great ape, you can read David Begun's The Real Planet of the Apes, which talks about the Miocene when apes first evolved and what makes them apes, as well as Peter Andrews' An Ape's View of Human Evolution. If you're curious as to why are Neanderthals extinct and we're still here, and what made us similar and what made us different, you can read Kindred by Rag Sykes, which is she's really a forerunning figure on Neanderthals in general. And her book Kindred is phenomenal in how it outlines just how weird and fascinating and interesting these close relatives to us were and how we interacted with each other. All of these are really wonderful texts if you just want to get started, and they're all pop science, so they're really easy reads in my opinion. And I hope some of you guys check them out.
What's amazing about you? You just vamp so much of this, right? I'm sitting here, I've got notes and show prep, and I'm trying to guide everything, and you just go. It's awesome, and it's impressive. Erika is a paleontologist. She is host of the Gutsick Gibbon channel. I will link to everything in the description box, and I'm going to go make a freaking donation to your channel because you have given so much to us today. You've just told the story, at least in a rudimentary form, in a way that we can understand and play along. Erika, so good to talk to you. Thanks again.
Oh, Seth, thank you for letting me be here. I truly had a blast. Remember, I'm giving my best effort at being brief on this. There's so much more out there. There are so many other hypotheses. I've talked about hypotheses that I find convincing. There's so much more to get into if you find this fascinating and if you want to learn more. So I can't stress enough, fact check me, creationists out there. Go see for yourself. I'd love to hear your opinion.